everyone, and welcome to another evening with the Neurohumanities Network. We're extremely excited to host this month's event and welcome you all. As I said, we're the Neurohumanities Network. We're a place that brings neurologists, humanists, and everyone else together to discuss the intersection between the humanities, the arts, and the neurosciences. We are a group of residents, trainees, medical students, fellows, early faculty, essentially neurologists who are interested in the arts and humanities and neurology and where these intersect. We are a growing team, so if you want to get involved, feel free to let us know, and then you can see your name and photo here on this little wall of team fame. We also want to acknowledge and thank the Arts and Humanities Initiative at Harvard Medical School for supporting our endeavor. We want you to stay connected with us. Many of you already are part of our newsletter and listserv, but if you're not, grab the QR code now. And you can also check us out online on our social media channels, as well as YouTube for all the archived lectures. And very excitingly, our new website where you can find all of this information as well. Upcoming events, our information about our team, past events, and other artists that we represent, and lots more exciting opportunities to get involved with the Arts and Humanities Network. Here's the link to our website. Huge thanks to our web designer extraordinaire, extraordinary vision, extraordinary execution, Rita Farhan, who put together this site for us, as I mentioned, with lots of different links and clicks. And feel free also to browse our past contest winners and then get involved. And we do have a little contact us where you can think about contributing to the blog or dropping your ideas so that we can get in touch with you. But without further ado, I want to take us on to today's seminar, in which we're going to hear from none other than one of our co-founders, Mattia Rosso, MD. He's going to be talking about dancing with spiders and what Tarantism can teach us about the neurohumanities. But before I hand things over to Mattia and let him share his screen, I can't resist the opportunity to give a proper introduction and also embarrass him with lots of shower of compliments. But Mattia Rosso is a movement disorders fellow at Yale New Haven Hospital. He completed his neurology residency at the Medical University of South Carolina, where he served as chief resident for his final year of training. And it was during this time in person at MUSC that he developed a neurohumanities group alongside our other co-founder, Charlie Palmer, and that focused on monthly meetings at the intersection of humanities and neurology for the past 2 years. From there, the, let's say, social cultural phenomenon grew viral, became this national neurohumanities network, and that's a little bit of a foreshadow for what we might hear about today in our talk. But some of his fun facts is outside of work and his neurohumanistic passions. Mattia enjoys cooking, reading, fiction, nonfiction, expanding his film knowledge, and taking care of his two cats. And what I want to add to that is that he is an extraordinary collaborator, a wonderful, thoughtful partner in terms of neurohumanities, medical education, and basically just like good life advice. So I'm lucky to have him, on speed dial and speed text message for everything and anything that I may ever have questions about, from neurology to just what's the purpose of life. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mattia.
Galina, thanks for that wonderful introduction, and also thanks everyone for being here. And before starting, I actually wanted to say a few words about someone who couldn't be here, Dr. Aparna Nair, who was originally supposed to be giving this month's talk, which would have been on epilepsy and art. We are hoping in the future to have her feature the talk, but unfortunately she couldn't make it due to some personal reasons. So we wish her all the best and hope to have her back soon. But now I want to start by talking about today's talk. And now the title that you may have seen is Dancing with Spiders, or what Tarantismo or Tarantism may teach us about the neurohumanities. And I'm hoping in the next hour or so to really not only talk about Tarantism, but also to use this as a case study in what the neurohumanities can be. And to talk about some of the learning objectives for today, first of all, we're going to describe the historical phenomenon of Tarantismo and its neurological features. Don't be daunted if you've never heard about Tarantismo. We're going to explain what it is. Next, we're going to analyze a very important figure in this disorder, Ernesto de Martino, and his anthropological interpretation of Tarantism. We're then going to compare Tarantism with functional neurological disorders, which, just as an explanatory term, it's also known as psychogenic neurological disorder, and also about mass psychogenic illness. So, sort of understand how Tarantism falls into the spectrum. And finally, we're going to reflect on the role of cultural frameworks in shaping symptom expression and healing. And before actually telling you what Tarantism is, I want to go back to some historical sources. I think we learned so much by just reading how other people have described certain disorders. And I want you to keep an open mind. Before me telling you what it is, I just want you to hear how it may present. And this is some writing from a Neapolitan physician from the 1700s, Niccolò Cirillo. And now I'm going to translate this from the Italian, just the highlights. So this is 1721, and this physician, she sees a woman of the age of 40 years of age that gets admitted to the hospital. And they think she has some kind of delirium. And what's been happening is that for the last couple of days, she stopped wanting to eat, what we call anorexia. So she doesn't want to eat, and then she has a fever, and she's very weak. So we have fever and generalized weakness. And then he comes and looks at the patient as we do in medicine, and she's very still. She's not moving her body, with the exception of some rhythmical movements of her hands and her head. And there seems to be some kind of musical rhythm to this. At that point, the physician suspects tarantism. So she gets transferred to another hospital, and at that point, the only cure is to get a bunch of musicians into the hospital, and they start playing a melodical rhythm that is called tarantella. You may have heard about this. So tarantella is the music, and then her movements of the head and the hands start becoming more evident, and also start to be entrained by the music. And now I want to play a game with you all. I'm going to play a video. We're lucky enough to actually have a video of what Tarantism looks like. And what I would like you to do, if you can, is to just write in very simple words, in your own words. State you're not a medical doctor. I would like you to write what you see. So we're going to play this wonderful video. And please let me know if you have any issue seeing it.
La tarantata si fa ragno, diventa il ragno che è in lei. Il suo pensiero si muta in ritmo puro e nel movimento quasi meccanico sorgono figure di liberazione, travolte però ancora da ombre disperate.
All right. And as the video goes on, I'm gonna read some of the comments that you all had. There seems to be a pattern here. large volume movements, changing in frequency and training to the music, synchronized to the rhythm of the music. There's also a very interesting comment about rolling back and forth, and toward the end, you've probably seen that she actually stands up and starts dancing. And I completely agree. I think these are all great comments. Someone said it's almost purposeful, which is interesting. Again, trying to match the music rolling back and forth and legs slightly dancing. So I completely agree with all of these comments, multiple parts of the body, exactly. So very good. And um, going to another original source, by the way, that was a video from a documentary that was made in the 1950s. Um, and something else that we know from this writing by Cancellieri is that what was the reason for these movements? And he comments that Tarantism was due to the bite of a spider, specifically the wolf tarantula, which is tarantula in Italian. And then he says, well, this is due to this bite of the tarantula. And what happens as a result of this bite, the person starts crying, dancing, throwing up, trembling, laughing, becoming pale, yelling, having a very strong pain, and then after a couple of days, the person would die, unless one would find the remedy for this. And one that he describes is sweating, actually. But the king of all remedies is music, as we've seen. And lastly, I want to bring up a case study. This is yet another patient, but one that lived in the 1950s. So, we go from the 1700s, which certainly was during the Enlightenment, but uh, people, physicians didn't have the tools that we have now. This is almost modern, right? 1950s, almost contemporary. And here we have the case of Maria Di Nardò. Her story goes that she was orphaned by her father at age 13. Unfortunately, she had a very strong bond with her father, not so much with her mother. And then her mother and her moved into the house of her uncle and aunt. Why is this important? Well, this was a very traumatic time for multiple reasons, but especially because the uncle and aunt didn't really like her, apparently. Age 18, she falls in love, but the love is unrequited. And at that point, another big trauma for her, she promises her life to Saint Paul. Saint Paul is a very important saint of this whole story and an important saint in southern Italy. Where in southern Italy, we'll talk about the geography in a second. But she promises her love to Saint Paul. But then, being a poor woman and being in southern Italy, where at that time the role of the woman was not so respected, she was forced into marriage to a local peasant. She wasn't in love at all with this person. And also, she felt that she betrayed St. Paul. At that point, Tarantism starts. She starts hallucinating, or to tell her story, she starts seeing Saint Paul, who tells her that she wronged him and that she would have to follow. The Saint Paul would follow her, but also she would have to follow Saint Paul. And at that point, Saint Paul tells her that she would have to start dancing. So she would dance without stop for 9 days, and then finally they got the musicians to her house. She was healed, but she made a pact with Saint Paul that every single year during the summer she would have again to go through Tarantism and start dancing for a short period. And now this is another key feature of Tarantism that we'll see. This presentation is frequently recurring, and also it was overrepresented in women. All right, now let's take a step back. Let's take a step back and give a more general description here. What is Tarantism? We could think about it as a dancing plague, a disorder characterized by mood symptoms, but also this need to dance. that was local to southern Italy, particularly this region here that is shaded, Apulia, but was also seen in Campania, Calabria, and Sicily. It really peaked between the 15th and 17th century. The earliest account that we have are from the 11th century, some maybe even earlier. The first widely accepted description dates to 1446 by the physician Sante Arduini of Pesaro. But you heard me, and I showed you some real videos of this. So this was still going on in the 1950s, where Ernesto De Martino described it. However, it was really waning and it has now disappeared. And this will be a key to really deconstruct what this syndrome really is. In medicine, we frequently talk about illness scripts, meaning how illnesses develop. And the very initial phase is thought to be the spider bite here. This is a picture of a wolf-based spider, also known as the tarantula. The second phase then follows with the illness. But let's stay with the bite for a second. It's thought to be the bite of this little critter here, the Lycosa tarantula. The bite, though, may be witnessed, but most frequently is unwitnessed. And a lot of the time, turns out it's not a true bite of a spider. It's more of a metaphorical bite. And we'll get into this in a second once we deconstruct this syndrome. Then people can start experiencing some pain and swelling. This is quite rare, actually. And the actual disorder starts between really just a matter of hours to up to 3 days after the bite. What are the symptoms? You heard me summarize those original writings, but overall they're quite vague and multisystemic. There can be some fever, some confusion, people can pass out, also known as syncope. There can be heartburn, palpitations, but then there are two extreme poles. One is characterized by insomnia, by inability to sit still, this tendency to sing, to dance, to act out, really. And then the opposite pole is one where someone may sleep too much, may be sad, may have a lack of movement. So there are these two extremes, one that's almost too much movement, where there's too little movement, one where there is almost a state of mania, and one where there is almost a type of really depression. And this is also summarized here with the ballerina, which is the extreme activity, and mute tristi, which is the sad and contrite. And this will also be key in understanding more about this. You heard me say something about hallucinations, and hallucinations can also be part of Tarantism. There is here an example of Pietro, who would frequently talk to the saint, and again, we come back to Saint Paul, and he would have these very interesting hallucinations where he described the saint as a man of a normal size, carrying a spider, carrying a sword, having very colored images with him. And then he also describes the hallucination as a 3D image, unlike the 2D image that you may see on a screen. And then another example is here the example of Carmela, who doesn't hallucinate a saint, but hallucinates a scorpion that is black, that has big lips, actually, that is carrying a hat, and that is telling Carmela how long she would have to dance, how much she would have to dance. And then we go to the cure. As you've seen, the cure is really through music. And this is a true exorcism, a musical exorcism. Instruments included the tambourine, the violin, the guitar, but there would also be a use of colored ribbons with specific color coding. There were colors that would make the person affected by Tarantism more angry, more active, and other ones that would be more soothing. These sessions may last for multiple days. They would usually be characterized by this rhythm of music, which is known as tarantella or pizzica. Pizzica has a meaning which is also that of a bite. So again, the bite of the spider, the bite of the music. And they would usually go on with particular refrains. Then there would be pauses where the person dancing would just fall on the ground, and then they would restart, but last for many days at a time. And this is another original writing where they give a description of what happens with this musical exorcism. There would be three musicians, and then there would be a white sheet on the floor where the person would be dancing. And also, there are some additional accounts. This is from Stephen Storace, who was a musician who lived in the 1700s, who goes to southern Italy. He tells people that he cannot play the music once they come across someone affected by Tarantism, but that he could learn it on the spot. So he starts playing, and then, as you can see here, the instant I left off playing, the man fell to the ground and cried very loud, distorted his face, legs, and arms, and then scraped the earth with his hands, and was in such contortions that clearly indicated him to be in miserable agonies. So I think this is a wonderful example of what happens if you actually stop playing. And then Wilhelm Katner, who wrote The Enigma of Tarantism, wrote, "It could appear to someone as being humorous and ridiculous, but when the drummer stopped to play for a short period of time, the patient suddenly seemed to go numb, lose his senses, and faint." And then I told you a little bit about the color coding. This is also very important. And the room of the ill person would really be outfitted with numerous ribbons and silken sashes. That is part of the exorcism. So a musical exorcism, a choreotic exorcism, and a chromatic exorcism. So dance, music, and color. And now we come to another aspect of the cure, which, as we'll see toward the end, is something that probably came on later in the history of Tarantism, but it's the Christian aspect. So the pilgrimage to a city called Galatina. You'll see it here shaded. It's in this region, which is Apulia, a small city in Apulia. And after the musical exorcism, by June 28th and 29th, someone who was healed from Tarantism would have to go to Galatina and ask for a grace. This was during the feast of Saint Peter and Saint Paul's. Again, we come back to Saint Paul. And there's an interesting legend about Galatina. Galatina is said to be the only city within Apulia to have no cases of Tarantism, and that was because St. Paul spared Galatina from this condition. All right. And then the final aspect to underline is that every year Tarantism would come back. So there is an aspect of this condition which is cyclical. Now, I want to stop here, and I think you all should be able to see a little poll that we left for you. And what I would like to do, there we go. What I would like to do is I want to stop here and hear from you all. What do you think is the most likely cause? Based on all the symptoms that I told you, we have functional or psychogenic. For those that are not familiar with this concept, we sort of think about functional and psychogenic disorders as somewhere there is a physical manifestation that is thought to be more of a mind body kind of issue as opposed to a physical lesion, if you will. The second option is spider venom induced mania, and then hypermotor disorder due to an infection. There are some infections that can cause dance-like movements, as maybe some of you know, and finally a cultural phenomenon. I think we have a good split here. I see that we have cultural phenomenon being in the lead. Also, some people are saying functional and psychogenic. We have some people who think it could be due to an infection, which is not unreasonable at all. All right. So I think we reached a bit of a quorum here. And let me continue to our next part. So to really help us understand and deconstruct Tarantism, which will be the second half of the talk, I want to introduce our main character, Ernesto De Martino, who was an anthropologist, an Italian anthropologist, who is really a legend in his field, and he was really interested in these cultural phenomena. And to understand Tarantism, and mind you, this is toward the end of the existence of this condition, right? So he understood that this was probably the last chance to capture and actually interview people who suffered from this condition. He assembled an ethnographic team, and this is where my idea that this condition is an interesting case study into what the neurohumanities can be, because he assembled a very varied team. He had an ethnomusicologist, he had an anthropologist, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a social worker. And what he did over the span of a few years is that he went on and interviewed people that suffered from Tarantism. He saw them, he saw Tarantism firsthand. He also contributed to those videos that I showed you. And what we're going to do, partially through the work of Ernesto De Martino, is actually go step by step in the illness script and really try to analyze. First of all, let's start with the spider bite. So we talked about the wolf tarantula, which is certainly a little bit of a scary critter, but it's pretty innocuous. It won't really bite you. It will not really cause any issues. It's certainly big and it jumps and it has a lot of those dance-like movements almost that you may see in the patients, but doesn't really do any harm. There is another spider in southern Italy, which is Latrodectus tridecim guttatus, in other words, the Mediterranean black widow, which is much smaller, but its bite actually can lead to some symptoms, and we'll analyze this in a second. But I also want to say a couple of more things about the spider bite. Most of the time, the spider bite would be for the ill person metaphorical. They would be usually bitten, if you will, in the midday, and it's usually while thinking about a lost love or being demoted by the person's condition in society. And finally, in some other cases, they're not talking about a spider at all. They're talking about scorpions, or they're talking about snakes and so forth. A little bit of analysis into could Tarantism be due to the Black Widow. There are some symptoms that are certainly in common between the two. One would be generalized weakness in the Black Widow bite, agitation, anxiety. But most of Black Widow bites actually last only for a couple of days, and then you recovered from it. Whereas Tarantism may last for weeks and then again come back. And some other symptoms like rhythmic dancing is really not a feature of a spider bite. And then DeMartino also analyzes the demographics of who gets a Black Widow spider bite. And in this case, in Southern Italy, mind you, was mostly men. The reason being that at that time, most men were working in the fields, especially in Southern Italy, and that's when they would be bitten by Black Widows. On the other hand, Tarantism was mostly taking place in women. It was a fairly common condition, whereas spider bites were still pretty rare. Treatment from a spider bite is usually conservative. We, of course, have antivenoms now, and then Tarantism was music. So not really fitting here. And then there are examples, though, as the example of Pietro Di Nardò, who actually gets bitten by a spider and gets all the symptoms from a spider bite, including rigidity, headaches, pain, and urinary retention. But that only lasted for 2 days. But then when he gets admitted to the hospital, after a couple of days, he starts dancing. So interesting coincidence, which now we think was more of a coincidence, not the cause, but more the scare from the spider may then have precipitated what is more of a cultural reaction, if you will, in Tarantism. And this brings us to our next point of what the illness really is. Now, these two poles of too much action, too little action is not extremely typical for more of a, if this was a spider bite, but it is actually typical to see these extreme, these almost contradictory variants of such a disorder in more, if you will, psychogenic or functional conditions. And another key is with the seasonal recurrence. It would often recur in the summer, and also the demographics are certainly also interesting. They were mostly people who were in dire straits in the society. They didn't have much of a say in the society. They may have some underlying depression, anxiety. So interesting to analyze that. And then I want to take a little bit of a step back now, if we're saying that this condition was more of a culture-bound, accepted reaction to otherwise more psychological challenges, if you will, or social challenges, if you will, and taking a step back and thinking, does this condition, is there anything similar to this in other areas of the world, right? Seeing a condition that is such a unique condition may feel like we're dealing with something that is really not comprehensible. But I want to say that there are similar syndromes that we may have seen, for instance, in Maine in the past, the jumping French mane of Maine, a syndrome called LATA in Malaysia, and then Myriachit in Siberia. And I'll say just a few words about these three conditions because maybe that you all have never heard of these. Starting with the jumping French mane of Maine, this was again culturally present within the lumberjacks of Maine, was characterized by an exaggerated startle response, and they would have this reaction where they would lift the shoulders, raise the hands, strike, throw, cry, and tumble. And there is this wonderful excerpt from George Beard from 1880, where he describes that it appeared that in the evenings, the lumberjacks would tease each other and play this game of startling one another. In a certain sense, we were all jumpers. An alarm of fire in a crowded building would have the same effect upon very many of us. And staying on the concept of startle, we go to a very different area of the world, Malaysia, where we have again a unique condition that is seen only in Malaysia, which is known as LATA. And here, the person who is a LATA tends to have these exaggerated startle reactions, but then have something else that we don't see in the jumping Frenchman of Maine, which is this tendency to repeat what others say, echolalia, to copy what others do, echopraxia, and the concept of automatic obedience, where they would just do what they're told to do, and also excessive violence that they would have. And here there is a note, there is an excerpt from O'Brien who says that these Lata people would be okay, usually the essence of propriety, but then nervous emotions would cause them to become violent and also involuntarily to imitate the words of the words and sounds and gestures of those around them. And similar to this, and this will also be important in the closing segment of this talk, is Myriachit. Again, another startle condition that is seen in Siberia. Interestingly enough, you see how wide the region where we see Myriachit. Again, a startle syndrome seen in the Sami people. They would also have this tendency to copy others, echopraxia, to have forced obedience, to have violent outbursts. After startle with subsequent amnesia. And what's important about Mirachit is that this is the disorder version, if you will, but the same people or the same family may have something that's very similar to Miriachit, um, which is seen as something sacred. They're usually shamans. So these same traits of the disorder make them sacred as well. And the final note about, especially about Lata, is that while we may view this as a disorder, people who have it don't really view it as something to be healed from, to be cured from. So the reason why I mention these is that they're culture-bound conditions which are not thought to be due to some kind of brain lesion or to be due to an infection, but to just be a cultural manifestation, if you will. And now the opposite of it is some of these, if you will, functional or psychogenic conditions which are not bound to a culture, but they may occur as epidemics. And we talked about Tarantism, which is sort of the endemic version of a dancing plague, but we also had dancing plagues. What were dancing plagues? Dancing plagues were seen mostly in the Middle Ages, but the most famous one actually happened toward the end of the after the end of the Middle Ages in 1518, and they would be outbursts where entire villages would start dancing without any control. For instance, in 1518, in the streets of Strasbourg, 50 to 400 people started dancing without control. And this was thought to be a mass psychogenic illness. Similar outbreaks took place in the Middle Ages, and interestingly enough, probably took place really close to moments of infectious epidemics. So maybe we had plagues within plagues. And furthermore, maybe we had these dancing plagues alongside other people who had, let's say, a streptococcal infections. They may have had um, also dance-like movements, but due to an infection and due to chorea. And speaking of pandemics within pandemics, another epidemic of what we think is a functional neurological disorder took place really recently. So not all of this is the ancient past, but we're living it. And this happened during the pandemic, and they're known as TikTok tics. And it was the appearance of tick-like behaviors in TikTok users. And these tick-like behaviors seem to just spread through the social network. So really be hard to understand whether these were actual ticks or functional ticks, but the mechanism here was really interesting. Again, spreading through the network, spreading acutely, like an infection almost. And they were different than ticks. There would be a predominance of arm movements, of swear words being used, specific words like beans, and also overall a greater severity, interestingly enough, than ticks. All right. And then next up, I think we still have some time to talk about the final phase of our deconstruction, which is that of the musical cure or musical exorcism. Now, we need to take a step back and look at the history of musical exorcism and music as medicine. Now, we have to go all the way back to ancient Greece now. Now, stay with me, there's a reason for this. And we go back to the ancient cults of Dionysus, also known as Bacchus. We may remember him as the god of wine. It's more complex than that. And he would have these followers, which were usually women, the Meniads, who would dance. And really, this was a sacred act of using dance and also using wine to reach the gods. And now we go from ancient Greece to still Greece, but not as ancient. We go to Pythagoras. Pythagoras, we may remember from the theorem, but he was a philosopher and also he had followers. And there's something called Pythagorean medicine, which among other things used music as a healing practice. And now we go to southern Italy, where the players, the musicians, would heal by music, even in their capacity of public officers to help the poor. So you may say, okay, why did you go all the way from Greece to southern Italy. Well, turns out that southern Italy was very influenced by Greece. As a matter of fact, the regions that you see here were known as Magna Graecia, which is the expanded or big Greece, if you will. And this dates back all the way to the 8th century. Pythagoras himself lived and died in Croton, which is here, so not too far from Apulia. So it goes to show that musical exorcism was probably present for a long, long time in southern Italy. And then where does Catholicism come into place? Well, the thought is that Catholicism in the cure of Tarantism is something that was really late in the game. So it was incorporated in Catholicism probably in the 18th century. Southern Italy was looked down upon by the rest of Italy and also by the Catholic Church. To the point that they would send missionaries to southern Italy, much in the same way they would send them to other areas of the world. And this appropriation was thought to um, add some foreign elements, like Saint Paul came way late into this whole iconography and then created these very contradictory stories about Saint Paul's, healing the ill person, but then also being the one doing the biting. So some foreign elements. And the thought is that once Catholicism came into the picture with these modifications, the bond, if you will, between these psychogenic manifestation of maybe sorrow, maybe the person's role in the society, and then this healing was broken by adding some foreign elements. And this really goes into the concept of what Ernesto de Martino calls the cultural apocalypse, which is really the end of the Southern Italian culture. So by the 80s, industrialization had changed Southern Italy. There was a loss of tradition. There was also a loss of knowledge about these rituals, these musical rituals, and then also loss of culture and loss of culture-bound phenomena. Not all of this is bad. Probably part of what was going on in Tarantism was also the fact that the marginalized members of society, which were especially women who didn't have much of a say in southern Italy, used this, whether consciously or very likely unconsciously, as a mechanism to escape. And a lot we don't know about how these mind-body phenomena work, but it is possible that this was a mechanism. In losing this, which is great that people have a more representative role in society, but in losing this, we also had the loss of the knowledge of music, though. So music as treatment, unfortunately, we have no remaining sheets of the original tarantella. We certainly have new sheets for tarantella and pizzica. And what the music would do, though, was induce in a trance or almost a hypnotic state. And music to this day is used as a form of therapy. And I want to spend a few words on saying that next month we have our July music panel with a combination of experts, both Dr. Panteliat, who's a physician at Johns Hopkins, and then also two musicians, Raiko Futing and Thomas Palmer from the Manhattan School of Medicine. So more to come on music as treatment. But if music induces trance states, and trance states can be used to heal, what can we learn here? So healing through tarantella was done through prolonged and exhausting dancing. The trance state induced is similar to trance states in other conditions, in other cultures. And these include the trance states in shamanic rituals. And these shamanic rituals, you may think back to what we were saying about Mirachit. These shamans in Siberia are the same from similar families to people suffering from Mirachit. And then we have other trance states in other cultures, like the Shanghyang trance in Bali. And then finally, these whirling dervishes of Sufi Islam. And since we're talking about dance, just a shout out back to our prior session on Dance and the Brain, where Dr. Theophanopoulou gave a masterclass in this. You may catch it on our YouTube as well. So what are some of the take-home messages here? First of all, I hope that with our talk today, we also gave a sneak peek in how we can use history as a guide to understand our brain and modern world. For instance, if we think about when TikTok ticks appeared, we may have felt that was a unique condition never before seen. But I think reading back to the history of medicine can be really humbling and give us some more context into how people behave. And this reminds me of the masterclass that Alison Christie gave us on on the medical historical method. I also want to commend what Ernesto De Martino was doing with this very varied and multi team, multi-talented team that he had to explore Tarantism. And I want to say, I think we can think about how we can make the neurohumanities as a team sport, where we have neuroscientists and humanists really collaborate and find a common language, but also learn from each other in a very humble way. And then finally, I want to say it's really interesting to me to think about Tarantism as this culture-bound phenomenon, which to a physician may look like a disorder, where every single part of it is a disorder and something that we should eradicate. On the other hand, I'm reminded of what Jesus Ramirez Bermudez was telling us in a recent session about the importance of narratives in thinking about the first person, the second person, and the third person. So again, the lens of a physician is to see disorder, but then the lens of someone like De Martino was to look at culture and not to foreclose ourselves or anchor ourselves into seeing everything as a disorder, but really trying to understand cultural mechanisms. And speaking of cultural mechanism, this will be a final thought that I wanted to leave you all with, which is, are we witnessing a shift? The cultural syndromes that I talked to you about have all in common that they're either gone, like Tarantism and by and large jumping French Main of Maine, they're disappeared, or going. And Lata syndrome is thought to be on the decline. Myriad shade is also almost all disappeared. I will say there is a wonderful article with Andrew Lees as one of the authors from 2025, where he actually looks at the epidemiology at the moment, but it's certainly less common than it used to be. So these cultural syndromes are disappearing. Are we seeing a trend in another direction, where instead we have these epidemic functional disorders, which may spread through social media or through information? Or through just how our social networks have changed from being ones where we live in a culture to where we live in a very fluid culture where we're constantly moving, but we're also in contact with the entire world. So with that, I'm going to leave some time for any questions that you all may have. Hope you all have enjoyed, and I hope I've left you with some more thoughts about how to take the neurohumanities further.
Mattia, what an incredible talk. Um, I feel like this was tailor-made to so many of the discussions you and I have had over the past years. I could talk about this lecture and a lot of things you touched on, I feel like for hours. And what an incredible transition between Tarantism and all of the other neurohumanities lectures we've had over the past essentially year. So I think this was an amazing way to cap off the academic year. Thank you so much for your talk. I feel like I want to rewatch it again already, but I did have, while we're waiting for more comments to kind of come in, I did want to get your thoughts on a couple of things. So I think first of all, you sort of touched on this, especially with some of the other culture-bound syndromes, and then in the comments I can see already Dong Chu kind of mentioned this, but your thoughts on our favorite movement disorder, catatonia, as a potential contributor to a lot of these syndromes. I mean, personally, I've seen some very odd movements associated with catatonia. Although I don't know a lot about like the role of music specifically. And now I'm thinking that I want to start playing music for all my catatonic patients and see what happens. But curious about your thoughts on that. And then point number two, the other thing you're talking made me think about was outside the realm of culture-bound syndromes and sort of this incredibly complex link between, you know, culture, possible infectious diseases, the role of like society, psychiatric illnesses, et cetera, all these incredibly complex things that I don't think we're ever going to be able to really untangle. It did make me think of another syndrome that is a little bit more clear in etiology, but not really, which is encephalitis lethargica, another disease that has been reported to have some like specific regional manifestations and movement disorders associated with it. And as an alternative theory, you know, you sort of touched on this as well when talking about the geographic features of each of these diseases. But you know, how much could a decrease in these, or how much could these be explained by like a neuroinfectious or an autoimmune etiology that is specific to a region, and we don't see that with the rise of globalism and like, you know, greater spare of antibodies, things like that. And there's a lot of questions pouring in, so I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I completely agree with a lot of things that you said. But the first thing, I'll start with catatonia. So, yeah, I saw the comment on the Bush-Francis scale as well. And what's interesting about catatonia is so many things, but one of the things that's especially interesting is that it's really at the intersection of like neuropsychiatric and motoric manifestations, if you will. I think much like Parkinson's disease, if we started thinking about catatonia in a different way, it would easily be a movement disorder, and Parkinson's would be a neuropsychiatric disorder. That being said, something else that's interesting about catatonia is that you have these dual poles almost, agitated catatonia and muted catatonia, right? Very much the same as in Tarantism. And I think you could probably say that a lot of the people that had Tarantism in another culture would have catatonia. And then I think what's interesting there is that how do we react with these, if you will, stereotyped way we have to react to some triggers. Um, how does it change depending on what culture you're in? And how do we pathologize things, right? We could have a separate talk about the birth of the clinic, but that Foucault wrote, right? But that's exactly what happens, that a lot of these people who had psychiatric conditions were formerly healed in a culturally accepted way, and now we heal them or we try through medicine. So I think there is a lot in common there. And again, I could go on with catatonia for more, but I'll stop there. And the second thing you said is, could some of these conditions be infectious or autoimmune, if you will? I think it's especially interesting if you look back to the dancing plagues, because sure, we can say that they were mass echogenic illnesses, but probably they were a mix of stuff, and again, the dancing plagues could be their own separate talk, but it's really interesting to look back at the phenomenology. What I think in the case of Lata and Mirachit, I think I would maybe push back a little bit, is that they seem to be non-progressive and seem to be really accepted within a culture. And I don't know that, with some exceptions, that something infectious or autoimmune would be too stable. But you wonder. It's a great thought. Um, and about music, what's interesting about music in Tarantism, I didn't have time to say this, but they note that hypermotor Tarantism, if you will, which is a term that I'm coining right now, but hypermotor Tarantism was really responsive to music. Hypomotor was not responsive. They were really nihilistic about the hopes of curing someone who was mute and sad. So interesting. But yeah, sure. Music as therapy in catatonia would be fascinating. I think it would be great. Um, and then I see some comments here. I see one that says, that maybe the representation of globalization and loss of isolated culture phenomena which required the geographic barrier to provide the milieu for them to develop. I agree with that. And I'll add something to it is that there's been some interesting work done about what social networks look like. And social networks, I want to clarify, I'm not talking about social media. I'm talking about the social milieu that a person has and how that changes between a globalized culture and a traditional culture. And I think it's interesting to think about how these illnesses may spread or not appear at all. So certainly the fragmentation of a culture will have, as a consequence, the loss of culture-bound phenomena. And I see there is another comment about thoughts on how this relates to things like sound baths and ecstatic dancing as ways to manage anxiety and trauma. I don't know that I have too much knowledge about this, frankly, but I think I think it's perfectly reasonable that it's related, especially in thinking about trance states, in thinking about really this aspect of trance, which is sort of of the loss of self, and then the reintegration of self. I think those are certainly interesting. And yeah, and the other aspect that I didn't have time to touch on, but something that we see a lot in functional disorders is, or maybe for people who are not medical, they may have heard the term hysteria, which is a term that I don't encourage using, but you may be more familiar with that concept. And the concept of suggestibility, the fact that they're very suggestible. And I don't think we should take this in a disparaging way, but in a how can we help people use this suggestibility to get out of it? Um, I think that's also interesting, something that can be done through music. How were people perceived culturally is another question from Dr. Antonio. Um, it really depends, but mostly they would be seen as someone to be healed and someone to take to the church and have healed. So they were part of society. They were not shunned. And then from a medical standpoint, are we too quick to pathologize the realm of normal? There's a curve and should be taken into context of the patient's social context. Completely agree. Completely agree. I think that's also one of the important aspects, which is the importance of narratives. And I think after hearing Dr. Bermudez's talk, I've been thinking a lot about how do we integrate our own lens with the narrative of the person, and how can we as a society be better also to to give people narratives that they can follow and not just be too quick to pathologize.
I think that's it in terms of questions. And this is perfect because we're right at time for the session. So I think we're about ready to wrap up. Mattia, thank you so much again for this talk. This is amazing.
Absolute pleasure.
Glenn, do you have those slides? Perfect. Thank you. So while everyone's still here, just in the last 2 minutes, just to plug the next kind of stuff that's coming up. So Mattia touched on this with his incredible transition from his own talk, but we have this music and brain medicine panel next month, July 17th. It's going to be really cool. This is the first panel discussion we're doing with a member from Hopkins Movement Disorders, Dr. Pentayet, talking about kind of music medicine, and then two folks from the Manhattan School of Music, both composers, talking about sort of time in music and then sort of the interplay between all those things. So I think this will be a really cool session. Hope to see you all there. And then the other
May
thing,
even be healing, right, Charlie?
right, might be healing for attendees. Um, the other thing to plug that's coming up, also really exciting, this is our next booster session. It'll be on August 5th from 8 to 9 p.m. And this is our first book club associated with the Neurohumanities Network. So we'll discuss Priya Anand's The Mind Electric. She will be discussing it with us. So this should be a really, really great session to come to. And this is definitely going to push me towards actually finishing a book in the next month or two. So hope to see you all there as well. Does anybody else have anything else to add or any other questions? Looks like no. Okay, well, as always, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It's been really exciting to see kind of things grow over the past academic year. Hope to see you all next year.
Have a good night, everyone.